So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to start the next session on this conference. And this morning we had a presentation from the European Commission about everything which is happening in the Fit for 55 program and what's happening on the policy side. And today, or in this session, we'll talk more about the maritime energy transition. So as you're well aware of, we are at the verge of a huge challenge. We need to decarbonize shipping, and by 2050 we need to reduce the shipping emissions by 75%. And currently there's a lot of uncertainty on what is the best solutions and how are we going to cope that. And in the next session, we're going to go really deep into the different energy carriers. And in this session, we're going to talk about, okay, what can we do now and what is the different role of the different stakeholders. And we have a really excellent program today with 3 speakers in the room and 1 virtual. So first speaker in the room is Mr. Ashley Wood. So maybe if you can stand, not everybody can see you. He's the head of global environmental improvement from Maersk. We then have Douwe van der Stroom, who is a program manager on twin transition between green and digital from the Port of Rotterdam. So the port's perspective, really nice to have you. And we have Ahila Karan from the Lloyd's Register Maritime Decarbonization Hub. And she's involved in all kinds of setting up all kinds of corporations, I think, with different stakeholders. And we also have virtual Elisabeth Munk from, and she's global sustainability manager from IKEA, so from a shipper's perspective. And I see, Elisabeth, that you're already there. And we would like to start with your presentation, please. So we're really curious on what you're going to present to us today.
Thank you so much. I can see the presentation is already up there. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so sorry that I cannot be with you in person in the room, but it's a pleasure to be here today to discuss the important topic of decarbonizing ocean shipping. So my name is Elisabeth Munk. I'm leading sustainability in IKEA supply chain operations. And we are responsible for the global transportation of IKEA home furnishing products from the suppliers to the warehouses and stores. So I would like to share with you today how we work with tackling climate change, specifically in our transport operations, including land and ocean shipping. And if I might have the next slide, please. Our world is rapidly changing, and it seems like the speed of change is accelerating. And among the many challenges we have today, we see climate change happening right here and now with a severe impact on both people and planet. And next slide, please. In IKEA, we are guided by our people and planet positive strategy. And there are 3 focus areas in this strategy. It's about healthy and sustainable living, creating a movement to enable and inspire people all over the world to live a better, more sustainable everyday life at home. And it's also about circular and climate positive, transforming IKEA into a circular business and working towards becoming climate positive. And thirdly, fair and equal, ensuring diversity, being inclusive, providing and advocating for meaningful work and a living wage. And if we move to the next slide, please, if we then look at the climate agenda in IKEA, we have record levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And it is quite overwhelming. Climate change is complex. How do we navigate in this environment? How do we make the right decisions? How do we come together to take the necessary measures to make change happen? Because with the urgency of climate change, we cannot wait for the perfect regulations or the perfect solutions. We need to make every year count. There is no pushing it forward. The achievements we manage to do today will set the preconditions for our livelihood tomorrow. So if we move to the next slide, we want to grow our business and become climate positive, meaning that we reduce more greenhouse gas emissions than our value chain emits. And we recognize that this responsibility covers the entire life cycle of our products. And to achieve this, we will drastically reduce the greenhouse gas emissions across the IKEA value chain, remove and store carbon from the atmosphere through better forest and agricultural management practices within the IKEA value chain, and then transform into a circular business, prolonging the life of IKEA products to ensure that carbon remains stored longer in our products and materials. And we do not do offsetting. We believe we need to address the root causes of the problem and find solutions to the problem itself, not balancing it somewhere else. And if we move to the next slide, please. So we use a science-based approach to fulfill our commitments, and we work together with our partners and suppliers and customers and other stakeholders around the world. And we engage in a number of partnerships and collaborations to support and further develop the climate work of IKEA. So next slide, please. So this is a picture showing the total carbon footprint of IKEA across the value chain. So it ranges from the materials that we use in our products, the greenhouse gas emissions from different manufacturing processes at our suppliers, the transportation when the products are used at home, and then the end of life phase. And as you can see from this picture, the biggest portion from the carbon footprint, it comes from the materials we use in our products, and also a big portion from when the products are used in our homes. And this is connected to the electricity use of products such as light bulbs or fridges, etc. And less than 5% comes from the transportation, the long-haul transportation of our goods from the suppliers to the warehouses and stores by land and ocean transportation. So the transport carbon footprint in this value chain perspective might seem relatively small, but we are a big shipper. We do approximately 2 million shipments a year, and as a big shipper, we have a big opportunity to influence, and of course, a big responsibility. And important to mention here also, in order to become climate positive, all parts of this value chain need to make the transformation to reach this target. And then if we take the next slide, please. Now, let's move to IKEA supply chain operations and our decarb agenda. We don't have any own trucks or trains or vessels. We buy all the services from transport and logistics service providers. So our target is to reduce the carbon footprint from every transport that we do by an average of minus 70% by 2030. And this is compared to a baseline year of 2017. And we also need to reach 80% of this target by 2028. So it's not a target to reach in the future. For us, it's very much here and now. And if we move to the next slide, where you can see the division of our carbon footprint, where we have then 1 million tons approximately in emissions yearly from the transportation side and logistics. So the land transportation is about half of this carbon footprint. Ocean transportation a bit more than 40%, and then we have a smaller part from the logistics units. So you can see that out of this less than 5% of the total IKEA value chain that comes from transportation, approximately 2%, less than 2% of the total IKEA footprint comes from ocean shipping. So if we take the next slide, so how do we then work with decarbonizing our transport supply chain? Well, first of all, we see that we need to build a diversified portfolio of solutions and tackle the challenge from different angles, and also to bring in the time perspective. And if we move to the next slide, please. we have our decarbonize agenda, where we work with what we call our 3R: reduce, replace, and rethink, where reduce is about increasing efficiency in everything we do by, for example, fuel efficiency measures, optimizing our network, increasing equipment utilization and fill rates, working with continuous improvements. And replace is about replacing fossil fuels with alternatives. We are focusing a lot on putting as much as we can on intermodal solutions, on rail, short sea barge, and we now have more than 45% of the global flows in ton kilometers on intermodal solutions, and we have about 50% on intermodal solutions on European flows. And replacing is also about replacing fossil fuels with biofuels. Rethink is about integrating innovations and new types of partnerships into our value chains. There are lots of new innovative technologies and solutions already out there, but we also need innovation in collaboration between different stakeholders in order to ensure that the solutions are deployed and scaled up. And it's also important here with the time perspective into this equation. We need to work short, mid, and long term in parallel with the same focus and intensity, because with the urgency, we cannot wait until with solutions that will come in 5, 10 years or even further. We need to walk with both the small steps and the big steps at the same time. And if we move to the next slide, please. So we are creating the roadmap to 2030 and beyond. And this is a continuous work, and it's becoming more and more detailed as we go. And there are, as we see, many different pathways into the future, and they all come with their challenges and opportunities. So it's important to have a clear compass of where we are heading so that we all in our organization navigate in the right direction. So if we move to the next slide, please. If we look at how do we then apply this for ocean shipping at a very, very high level, our roadmap looks like this. We have a focus on curbing emissions here and now, focusing on measures that can be used now or with relatively short implementation timeframe. And it's also about identifying, joining, creating the collaborations with different stakeholders to enable the industry transition. And the next phase focuses on accelerating the transition into zero emission technologies and renewable energy. And the third phase is all about scaling. If we take the next slide, we know that there is a big potential in energy savings and energy efficiency. And this potential, it goes across the whole of our value chain in an end-to-end perspectives, and also for ocean shipping. Because for us, it's not just about continue as is and then switch to a new fuel or a new technology when then that is available. We also need to reduce the amounts of energy that we use. And in order to capture these potentials, we need the visibility and granularity. We need more detailed data. And to reach our target, we are dependent on collaborating with service providers that share the urgency of this journey. Having the visibility and sharing detailed data will enable us as IKEA, together with our service providers, to really focus on the right actions to decarbonize ocean shipping and the transportation as a whole. And as the journey of climate action is progressing, the detailed data, the transparency, the visibility, the collaboration is becoming increasingly more important. So a strong fact-based foundation is important when working with the climate challenge. Equally important is about engaging and motivating people on the journey to have detailed targets that you can measure so you can see the movement. And next slide, please. Because every step counts, smaller and bigger. And the more steps we do, the more people that join in, that is how the necessary movement can happen. So if we go to the next slide, sustainable biofuels. Yes. So in 2019, together with shipping line CMA CGM, Good Shipping, and the Port of Rotterdam, we piloted biofuels for the first time ever on an ocean-going container vessel. And it sailed with a blend of marine heavy fuel oil and biofuel made out of waste cooking oil and forest residues. And this was successful, and it proved the possibility to use biofuels in ocean-going vessels. And since this pilot, we've also scaled up the use of biofuels in our ocean shipping. And we know that there will not be enough biofuels in the world to fuel ocean shipping, but we do believe it is an important piece of the puzzle to, in the shorter term, to curb emissions. And if we move to the next slide, please. So we have developed also an IKEA position on biofuels, considering the whole life cycle of the biofuels. It is about responsible sourcing of agricultural and waste materials. It's about visibility, transparency, traceability. And this is a way of thinking that is applied in everything we do across our value chain. And it's important that we offer also clear requirements and guidance for which renewable energy sources to favor and to support the prioritization of the use of different energy solutions for different parts of the IKEA supply chain. And if we move to the next slide. So at the end of last year, we signed the COSEV ambition statement, Cargo Owners for Zero Emission Vessels, aiming at only purchasing zero emission shipping by 2040. And with this ambition statement, we want to demonstrate our determination to reach set targets and also instill the confidence among the stakeholders across the industry that we believe this is the direction of our common decarbonizing journey ahead. And with this ambition statement, we also call for strong policy support to catalyze this industry-wide transformation that is needed. And we believe that collaborating with like-minded partners, we can create strong movements. And of course, we want more companies to join this movement. And let's move to the next slide, please. Ports, the importance of ports. And this is actually a new focus area for IKEA within our supply chain operations. And we've recently appointed a new project leader for ports because we see ports as important hubs in our supply chain and the interface between ocean and land transportation, and key players when it comes to enable decarb solutions, both for the ocean shipping and for land transportation. And with this new focus area, we want to achieve long-term partnerships and cooperation with ports and the stakeholders involved in port operations. And let's move to the next slide. We also believe it is important to share good examples to inspire and engage. We need to celebrate the small steps along the way because the climate journey will be a long journey and it will take a very long time before we can see any results in the global ecosystem. So we need to keep the spirit up and motivate and engage each other. Once a year, we are gathering good examples from across our value chain in transportation and logistics in IKEA. And we share this with all our partners and everyone that is interested. So please check it out. And if we move to the next slide, please. The climate challenge is complex. It cannot be solved by individual companies. So collaboration is key, and many different stakeholders across the value chain in ocean are part of the solution to the climate challenge in ocean shipping. So we all sit with different pieces of this solutions, and we need to sit around the table. We need to put this quite complex puzzle together and co-create and share information, be open and transparent in order to reach the common goal. And here we also need a bit of innovation on how we actually do this collaboration together. Let's move to the next slide. And here to conclude, in IKEA, we are on a journey with the aim to reach milestones in 25, 28, 2030, 2040. It's not an easy journey ahead. We know that we need to do more. We need to do more of the good things that we already do and replicate that, scale that up, etc. Gear up for the journey. And it's quite a tough weather forecast, so it's not going to be a walk in the park, and we need to accelerate and speed up, and we need to be faster. And the last slide, so let's connect and make it happen. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think it's really nice that you presented an overview of what a shipper can do. And especially if you're only doing this for 2% of your carbon footprint, well, I can imagine what you're going to do for the other 89 or 98%. So you covered a lot of topics, so maybe there's one or two questions from the audience before we move to the next speaker. Is there somebody who has who would like to have a clarifying question? Not yet. Everybody's still looking into what you've already discussed and the great details about it. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. You'll be here also for the round table later on, and then we'll continue. Oh, sorry, there was one.
Yeah. Is it on? All right.
Yep.
What's the origin of a lot of materials produced by IKEA?
There are many, many materials, different kind of materials. So this 50% of our carbon footprint, it comes from a number of different sources. So it's not just one or two materials.
I mean a geographic origin. Are these most of these produced in Sweden, or are these?
It's global. Global. It's global. It's in parts of the world.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah. So then we'll move on to the next speaker. So we have Mr. Ashley Woods. He is the head of global environmental improvement and capital investments at Maersk. And he's co-developing new environmental and ecosystem elements of Maersk's updated global ESG strategy.
Brilliant, thanks for having me. And what a way to start with Elizabeth talking about IKEA's ambition in this space. I'm actually going to touch on some of the elements that were mentioned there by Elizabeth, and particularly around the policy and the position they're having around sustainable biofuels. So what I'm going to start talking about is how decarbonisation can be a catalyst for so much more, particularly in the environmental space. So I'm going to take you through two examples. Then I'm going to show you some actual case studies of how we're utilising our decarbonisation journey to have those broader environmental benefits, and then come at the end with a kind of framework with how to think about it. So the first one is looking at decarbonisation within the transport sector in the UK. So somebody at some point came along and thought, well, diesel cars are more efficient than petrol cars, they produce less CO2, and you know, in the transportation sector, 50% of my emissions come from cars and taxis. So why don't I incentivize moving on to diesel vehicles from petrol? There was a sort of fund available, and you could get subsidies to buy your diesel car. And while it did have the effect of reducing the CO2 emissions, and you can see that, the pointer's not working, but on the transport line there, you can see around about 2010, there's a little bit of a dip, and they reduced their emissions by around about 6 megatons of CO2. It had a fairly unexpected consequence, and I think unexpected in the sense that while diesel engines were getting more efficient, this high uptake of diesel cars produced something quite unexpected. And what was maybe a bit unexpected was just how bad this switch would be for air quality. So as you can see there, first of all, in the maps, that you have this real concentration of particulate matter and nitrogen emissions within urban areas. And what the two charts show you, at the top is showing you within groups of 600 households, what percentage of those households live in poverty, what are the emissions they're exposed to from nitrogen dioxide and from particulates. And you see that the poorer those households are, the more emissions they're exposed to. But in the two bottom charts, what you see is that the poorer those households are, the less they contribute to the problem. So we've created injustice within society because of a decision made around decarbonisation. Probably not only about decarbonisation, but it had this consequence. Now, there's a lot of work going on to correct that. But this decision making is kind of interconnected with lots of different variables. The second example is actually how our work on ozone depletion and the protection of the ozone layer has actually had a positive impact on decarbonisation. So as many of you will know, that in the 1970s, this hole in the ozone layer was really beginning to become a known problem. And what happened was the Montreal Protocol was agreed, and actually it turned out to be ultimately a fantastic piece of legislation for climate change. So what we did is we tried to phase out the substances that were causing depletion in the ozone layer. So we moved from CFCs to HCFCs. And as we did that, we started to reduce the concentration of ozone-depleting substances in the atmosphere and allow the ozone layer to recover. But in that transition, actually, some of those refrigerants had very high global warming potentials. So initially, the work to protect the ozone layer had an unintended negative consequence in driving more climate change. And so in that world, we had to do something about it. And an amendment came along called the Kigali Amendment. And what that has done is helped constrain the impact of our phase-out of refrigerants to not only protect the ozone layer, but also to reduce the contribution that has to climate change. And as you can see there, that chart is pretty steep, kind of, without the measures of the Kigali Amendment. The programs that were in place to protect the ozone layer could contribute up to 0.5 degree of global warming by 2090. But with the Kigali Amendment, you see it will be limited to below 0.1 of a degree. Now, this story is not yet finished, and I'm going to come back to this. So, those two examples show you the interconnectivity between climate change, between air quality, between the stratospheric ozone layer. And this comes into this concept that all these systems are interconnected. The Earth is a system. And what you see is then that actually there is a way of thinking about it in terms of planetary boundaries. Because there are 9 systems at play that actually activities in one can have a positive or negative impact on the other. And within that planetary boundary concept, we have safe operating envelopes. So within the safe operating envelope, then there is no runaway degradation in the environmental system or unexpected changes. And the further away we get from the safe operating space, the more chances that those unexpected changes and consequences become something we can't come back from. But what's nice to know is if you look at the stratospheric ozone depletion part of the planetary boundary field, you see it's actually within the safe operating envelope. So the positive thing is we've actually come back from being outside the safe operating envelope and brought ourselves back in. Now we can apply this thinking to the way that we go about our energy transition and decarbonisation. Because if we look to 2050 or beyond 2050, the world that we're going to has 5 times more weather-related disasters. And 23 million more people are going to be forced to leave their homes as a result of climate change, severe weather events, access to clean water. And we will be consuming thousands of pieces of plastic, inhaling them or consuming it through our food. And also same in the environment. 1.8 billion people will be pushed into hunger. We'll lose another billion trees or billion acres of forest. And 50% of pollinated plants that are pollinated by bees will disappear, which is actually a lot of the fruit that we eat. Now, that's a pretty depressing way to start a presentation, but as I started off by talking about planetary boundaries, we've actually been able to come back for some of those boundaries. So how can we do that? So I'm going to go through 4 examples of how we can, and this is for you to take away and think about how you can bring this into your own organizations. So the first one is about greening your electricity supply. Many of you might be thinking about particularly larger operators using power purchase agreements and virtual power purchase agreements to green your electricity supply within, say, the European Union or within the US or other kind of multi-jurisdictional areas. And the concept works by you consume your electricity in multiple different locations, and then you commit to buy electricity from a new renewable project. It could be wind, it could be solar, and in doing so, you stimulate that project to go ahead. And then what you do is you get those zero electricity certificates and you green your consumption. So in a worked example, let's say we have 100 gigawatt hours of electricity consumption across our European operations. We stimulate and commit to purchase wind energy from a project in Sweden. That wind project goes ahead, and we have 100 gigawatt hours of green electricity to offset the electricity that we're consuming across the European Union. And as you can see, 100 gigawatt hours equals 100 gigawatt hours. And this is good. However, when you look at it from a purely CO2 basis, actually the 30,000 tons of CO2 emissions that we have across our European operations is not corrected by the just over 1,000 tons, which are reduced in the Swedish market by putting that wind energy project in place. So what we can do is maybe think about where do we want to stimulate that project. Every one of those locations in green, they have a higher grid intensity than our European average Scope 2 emissions that come from electricity consumption. So if I stimulate a renewable energy project in any of those locations, I will actually reduce CO2 emissions more than I contribute to. So that shows the planetary boundary. Actually, we're working on climate change, and then we can work on it a little bit more. Now, that same project, we could also start looking at it through a slightly different lens, through environmental and social descriptors. So thinking about where we place those projects, what their impact could be on biodiversity, on sensitive areas, where we place them in terms of water stress, thinking about how local communities could be impacted, we can have a way of actually screening those projects and making informed decisions. So trying to ensure that we actually make a more positive choice across a broader spectrum. And by doing that, you can see from the planetary boundary model, then we can actually be working in a couple of different areas. And there might be areas that we're not aware of that we're contributing to, either positively or negatively. And that's the part of this, the complexity means that we have to continue to look at it, look at the information, and then correct our course as we go along. So the second example is around equipment changing. So there are many different options available to us on how we change our container handling equipment over. And in that matrix, in the bottom left, you have essentially do nothing, but offset your emissions through CO2 credits. And then in the top right, you've got a world where you're using best available technology, so high levels of electrification, and coupling that with renewable electricity procurement. And so in a world where we just focus on the CO2 emissions, and maybe we go on an offsetting strategy, we contribute to one UN SDG. But actually, if we look at really going for around the electrification route, renewable energy sourcing, we can contribute to affordable clean energy, we can contribute to health on land, health in water, because our electrified equipment, they don't need washing so much, they don't consume lubricants, we don't have to carry big volumes of diesel on site that can contribute to land and ocean pollution. So those choices really matter. And again, then we start playing in a different area within the planetary boundaries. And the same can be said for choosing refrigerants for cooling. So we have a program in place, and people are looking at using lower global warming potential refrigerants. And as you can see there, again, the choices that we make can really contribute not only to protecting the ozone layer, but also in reducing our impact on climate change. However, you remember the story about the Montreal Protocol? What we're also now seeing is that some of those products, the HFOs in particular, so very low global warming potential refrigerant gases, are actually breaking down the atmosphere to create something called PFASs. Those of you that live in Belgium at the moment are probably aware of the controversy going on with the tunnels that are being dug around Antwerp. But these are persistent chemicals that do not degrade in the environment and are being linked to a whole host of health conditions. So we have other choices we can potentially make that still meet our climate change goals, such as using natural refrigerants, but maybe don't contribute to some of these other novel issues. And then the final one. So use of on-site renewable energy is good because it's additionality, it creates energy independence. But what we're seeing as well is that the rapid expansion of use of renewables is actually outpacing our ability to deal with the waste products that come from it. And as you can see there, the chart on the right-hand side from the Harvard Business Review actually shows that because also the technological advancements, particularly in solar, are happening so quickly, and the panels are becoming so cheap, that waste problem is actually likely to accelerate faster than we thought, because it would make economic sense to take your old solar panel and actually replace it before the end of life, because the output of the new, more efficient panels actually makes economic sense to do that. But what that does is accelerate our need to be able to deal with the waste products. So there are ways we can do that. Legislation does help here in the European Union. We have the WE directive. There's similar directives in the US. We're also looking at legislation in, say, places like India as well. But the thing we can do is enhance producer responsibility. So really if we can, make sure that the producers are actually going to take that product away at the end of its life and responsibly deal with it. And that could be recycling, or as you can see in one of those pictures there, reuse. Those turbine blades that can't be recycled, well, we can find another use for them. A bike parking, which is very apt for the Netherlands. So in those examples, you can see that our decarbonisation journey and our energy transition can drive much more environmental improvement. And it's hard, it's complex, and we need to keep thinking and looking at it. But there's another element to this, which is the social element. So in that same scenario where we're developing or creating a lot more electronic and electrical waste than we can currently deal with, I want to introduce you to the burner boys of Agbog Bloshi in Ghana. So these guys are receiving lots of waste from all over the world and setting it on fire in what was a Ramsar protected wetland to recover the metals from it. Kids as young as 6 working in these sites. Now, this shouldn't be able to happen because of enhanced producer responsibility and legislation, but there are many ways that this can happen. And suddenly find that we're having a social impact through our energy transition, and it isn't just. But what you can also see is from the planetary boundary theory, actually, we don't really have a way of capturing that. So we need a slightly different lens. And that different lens actually says we have something in the middle, which is our social foundation. And where we can overshoot in terms of our environmental impacts, we can also undershoot in terms of our ability to care and protect for people on the planet. And so in this same example, then we can see the elements that we can touch on the planetary boundary perspective, but also inside the circle, see where we're maybe not living up to our the needs of society around things like water, food, access to education and health, because of actually what's happening within our supply chain. So the takeaways, I've got 3 for you to think about. If we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we still lose 70% of the world's coral reefs. And if we hit 2 degrees, then we lose 90% or more. So every fraction of a degree counts now. And we have to, that urgency that our first speaker talked about is there, and we need to really act on it. But we can also deliver broader environmental protections. And we do that through some of the examples that I showed you there, and make every action count as broadly as it can count. And in protecting the environment, let's not forget the social side of it as well. The decarbonisation can have hugely different impacts depending on where you are in the world and which part of the supply chain you're in. And safety, equity, and justice are critical to this sustainability journey. And if we can keep some of those things in mind and keep correcting course where we need to, then that world in 2050 might not look like I showed you, but it might be a world with rich and biodiverse ecosystems, and where 9 billion people actually live well, and not just well today, but well into the future. So, thank you.
Some questions. Thanks very much, Ashley. Are there some questions in the room for Ashley for his presentation? Because otherwise I'll use my moderator perk. Well, thank you for that. So you talked about the model, and I really liked that you introduced, besides just the climate issue, another set of boundaries which we need to look at. And it's really good to see that for some of them we are already in the green. With everything happening now, with the Fit for 55 and these kind of things, do you see that we're moving into the right direction with the other things, or what would be the most urgent thing to do? And what's the contribution from Maersk itself to work on this?
So a couple of elements there. I think all of it's almost as equal as important because the system is so interconnected. I think right now we are having a huge impact on climate change, and therefore our efforts also need to be of a magnitude equal to that. But it's just important to keep that broader perspective, I think. And some of the science around this is well known, and some of it is emerging, particularly like these new persistent chemicals. We don't know so much about it. So I just think keep thinking about, maybe in the context of planetary boundaries, all the decisions that we make, how it can either positively or negatively impact in other areas. In terms of what Maersk is doing, so we're applying some of those principles. So like you saw there with the, using environmental and social screening to help us actually use a broader set of criteria with which to stimulate a renewable energy project, we do that. Same for looking at actually averaging out emissions and trying to pick locations for power purchase agreements that would actually have that positive impact. We haven't actually executed one of those yet, but we're currently working on it. And I think that this is where we also need to improve internally as well. So we have environmental and ecosystems is one of our 14 priorities, and that's where then we need to really connect across in all the environmental and social categories to drive that change. So it's no small task for anybody. But I think with collaboration, we can really get there. We just have to keep talking to each other and working together on these problems.
So again, we keep coming back to collaboration.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Definitely. All right. So if there's no more questions, or otherwise, just to keep it in mind for the Q&A after the presentations, then I would like to introduce Douwe van der Stroom. Douwe van der Stroom works for the Port of Rotterdam, so he didn't need to travel that much today. And he is passionate about conducting international business and politics for good interest in both energy and raw material transition. So you're combining digitalization with energy transition. I think that's a really nice topic for you to elaborate upon. So please take the floor.
All right, hi everyone. How is the energy in the room? I know it can be a long day at a conference like this. There's a coffee corner just around here, so if you want to pop in for a coffee and get caffeinated, then that's fine. As you can see, my name is Douwe van der Stroom. I work for the Port of Rotterdam, and therefore also in the position to wish you a very warm welcome here in Rotterdam, the home to the largest port in Europe. We're very excited to have you here. And just a quick show of hands, who is already in a business relationship with the Port of Rotterdam or has some sort of relationship through the port, operations or logistics? Okay, good. I see a few hands there. As you know, we are the largest port in Europe, and we have a big challenge to decarbonize, and I'll just briefly go through that with you today. Just a bit on myself. I sort of fresh out of university, just 2 years ago, I was at Oxford Circus, sort of disrupting Oxford Circus with a climate movement I was involved in. And now, a few years later, I thought, well, maybe just from the sidelines, some yelling is not the best way to always make change happen. So I started working for the port, given that a large amount of the emissions in the Netherlands is coming from our industrial complex and shipping going through. And so now I say, instead of blocking a road with a small sailing vessel, I work around these larger ships and making them come into the port efficiently and sustainably. Also last year I was involved at the Climate Top, working with our Dutch government, part of the Dutch delegation, and advising how best to decarbonize our ports. Just a bit about me. I think Elizabeth and some of the other speakers also really spoke on the reasons why we're all here today. I think we've seen some technical presentations and really standing still at the fact that what's at stake. And this atmosphere to me is always a reason to say, well, look, this is just about a few kilometers. If you drive 100 kilometers an hour, you can get through this in 5 minutes. And we are using it as a sewage at the moment. So I think it's quite a challenge for us to come from what we're doing there. And you can tell because the emissions are rapidly increasing. I think we've seen a few slides now already that are showing us the effects of climate change. Just to really emphasize the reasons why this energy transition is so crucial. And also, if you think of the fact, I feel a lot of people always think of the climate change and the climate crisis of something that is happening in 2050. I think this picture here in the just northern Germany and southern Netherlands of last summer show the effects of, for example, the extreme weather effect. So this is implicating a rain bomb, as we call them, that we've seen just last year. Effect very close to home and also happening right now. But are we ready? I mean, everyone wants to hear a bit of hope in this story, and I think the Port of Rotterdam definitely is capable of going through this transition, and I think you can base that on the fact of history. So if you go back in time, which I always think is a good way, you actually see how the Port of Rotterdam has developed over the different years, starting just center of the city. I don't know if I've got a pointer here, but we're, well, very much on the right side here. But the port goes on for about 40 kilometers, and we've been developing over the years. And we do that based on macroeconomic trends that you see all around. So for example, if you look at the time where we saw an uptick in car ownership, or if you look at the graph of world plastic production just after the Second World War, or if you see economic trends such as coal import and the use of that and the way that countries wanted to be more energy independent, just as we're seeing now with the Russia and Ukraine crisis or war. If you plot those different graphs on a timescale, you actually see that the Port of Rotterdam has constantly been developing with those macroeconomic trends. So from the 50s and 70s, we worked on the big refinery complex in the Botlek area, as we call it. We've also seen the Europort develop, which is very much a chemical cluster, again, based on this plastic production that we've seen an uptake in. And then we saw the rapid increase of the use of containers as logistical units, and then we built the Maasvlakte, allowing for large container terminals to trade in those logistic units. And so now what's next? And I believe the energy transition is clearly the one area that the Port of Rotterdam is now spending a large time and a lot of money on to make that happen. And we do that because it's not only that urgency that I've just indicated to you, but also because it's a very good and interesting business opportunity that I think a lot of people here in this room will also be thinking about in their line of business. And you've seen over the different years, again, macroeconomic trends such as mass production and automation, but I think really circular economy and the sustainability is what we could call a fifth industrial revolution. So how do we do that at the Port of Rotterdam? I think it's you can understand that it's quite a big challenge. We have an existing industry that wants to hold on to the responsibility that they have to supply 13% of Northwestern Europe energy use. So it's not something you can just shut off in one day. So at the same time, you want to embrace or work with existing clients and make sure that they can make the necessary steps to decarbonize. But you also want to embrace the new and work on the new energy forms that we see nowadays. So the Port of Rotterdam back in 2016 or 17 has set up this strategy, which we have called a 4-pillar strategy. I won't bore you too much with all the details. I'll just show you a few examples of how we put those energy pillars to use. What's very interesting to understand is that as a first pillar, we're looking into the existing energy infrastructure that we see in our industrial complex. What needs to be upgraded there? So you're looking maybe at carbon capture, you're looking at hydrogen infrastructure. That infrastructure also needs those new energies, so we're also looking in pillar 2 into where can we get that hydrogen, where can we get that renewable power to our port and for our industrial complex. And then as a third pillar, we're really looking into the circular economy aspect. So how can we make sure that our different clients are able to connect with each other and become a more industrial symbiosis industry. And fourth, and I think that's what most people hear, given that it's a supply chain conference, also very much looking into our role. I think Elizabeth also mentioned it from IKEA, the crucial role that ports can play in that supply chain. And we are a very important node within that supply chain to really turn around this decarbonation ambition. So an example, as I just mentioned, if you look at energy infrastructure, we're working very hard on carbon capture infrastructure, so that is taking carbon emissions from different industries. You can think of refineries such as those of Shell or Exxon, and sending that actually through a pipeline back into empty gas fields underneath the North Sea. But we're also working on a more sustainable infrastructure in that sense, such as the hydrogen backbone that we're connecting through the port, but also hope to connect to southern Netherlands, so the Chemelot industrial complex, and the rest of Europe, so mostly Germany. Very exciting project is Pillar 2. That's kind of fresh press here. I think it's just been announced a few weeks ago. On the second Maasvlakte, just at the very tip of our port, we have now announced that we'll build a very large hydrogen production facility together with 4 different companies, including Shell. And you see an artist's impression here. And if you go and look at the Maasvlakte, and I don't think you have the time because it's quite a long drive there, down there, but you can see already some construction. So these are not just plans, even though it might be just an artist's impression. This is actually already happening, and we're building this, and it'll be ready hopefully in 2025 or 26. Obviously, that infrastructure will be ready for that production of hydrogen to be used. And thirdly, this is also a very exciting project, just been announced 2 weeks ago. A company called Jadara, as part of Pillar 3, will be making biomethanol. So that's the biofuels that a lot of these companies have been talking about that they wish to be using in their supply chains. Very interesting fact. A lot of people will discuss the sort of employment role in this sustainability phase. So what happens with all these existing jobs in the fossil fuel industry? Well, as soon as this press release was published, we found that within a few hours, this company received a few hundred different CVs and applications of people that wanted to work for this renewable company making, based on used cooking oils and other things, making it into biomethanol. So that's a very promising thing that we see happening in our cluster. But then, I think most importantly for the audience today is our pillar 4, and that is looking into our sustainable transport and how we can play a role as a port to decarbonize that. So as of now, we see 25 million tons of emissions happening in the port. That is around 20% of the Dutch emissions, so quite a large chunk. Most of that, as you imagine, is coming from deep sea shipping. So very crucial to to spend a lot of time on working on that area to decarbonize over there. And we also see the role of what's happening in our port, about 3%, and also in the hinterland transport, so barging, etc. Different projects that we're working on to tackle those. I think a very interesting one is shore power as a role of a port. That's a very interesting one to take on. Ashley and I were already discussing a few projects that we're working on together as of now. Especially this one is very interesting. So this is the one of the largest platforms in the world, built by Hirema. Again, this is not just a strategy or a nice presentation of look what's happening in 10 years. This is already happening. So this platform is already connected to 20 megawatts of shore power. That's quite an exciting topic. And we're working now to also see how we can make that happen with some of the largest container terminals in the world, which you can imagine is quite the challenge. But again, I think we already mentioned it 100 times, but collaboration is key, so we can see that happening very strongly. And then, as Jorrit said, my role is also very much focused on how we can combine the digital aspect and the digital strategy that we have with sustainability and the energy transition. And that is a very interesting area to be looking at the moment, because it's rapidly developing. And Rotterdam used to be one of the largest ports in the world. Now we're not anymore, but we definitely have the ambition to be one of the smartest and one of the most sustainable. And so we're very much focusing on how can we make this port a more transparent place, more efficient, as we can see that deep sea shipping aspect, a large chunk of our emissions, efficiency can play a tremendous role in reducing that number. So you're thinking on port call optimization, just-in-time cruising, a lot of projects a lot of our time we spend on developing those projects. So as you can see, these are just some facts. About 50% of all shipping is experiencing delays. There's so much savings to be made if you express that in euros or dollars. And it also concerns the emissions, obviously. So that's why we spend a lot of time on this topic. A few examples that I'd just like to give to you, and definitely something to take a picture of as well if you are in the business and looking to reduce your emissions in that aspect. A tool that we've developed and that is readily available is called Port Exchange. It really helps you to optimize your entire port call and sort of streamline your operations to reduce your CO2 emissions. So as you can see here on the graph, it might be because the chairs are a bit high, but hopefully you can still see it. Let's say you depart of your port of origin. You can see that in the tool, and it will also help you find the right speed for you to arrive at the next port, at the port of Rotterdam in this case. And it will allow you to also see the amount of reductions that you can have in your emissions. So it will give you the right speed, so that's what we call the just-in-time cruising, and help you get there in time without too much waiting time and excess emissions. Another tool that we've been developing and that is still a working progress is an emissions portal. So we've developed with a few carbon footprinting experts different methods to calculate the emissions that are currently found in our port. So this is an example of a pilot ship that is working in the port of Rotterdam. So based on their AIS, so their locations based on satellite, we can determine what their emissions are in the port. And that helps us to engage with customers to see where can we start in reducing those emissions, and also gives us an area of focus. We might say, well, this particular segment or company or specific terminal faces a lot of emissions, and it helps us to really focus on where these emissions take place. So if you are a company interested to know exactly what your emissions are in the port area, feel free to reach out and we can have a look and see if we can find that out in the port. So I think that's it for me. We'll be having the Q&A, so hopefully there'll be some discussions. But feel free to reach out. I'm on LinkedIn. We're very happy to engage as a Port of Rotterdam. There's a lot of different projects running. Yeah, again, it's been mentioned 100 times, but collaboration is key. Elizabeth mentioned data. I think that's a very important one. We still see a lot of different partners in the supply chain holding back on collaborating on that front. So I'd very much like to invite you to play a role in those ambitions. My colleague Marijn is also there, so feel free to reach out to him as well. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Douwe. So our next speaker is Ahila Karan. She's a decarbonization analyst for Lloyd's Register Decarbonization Hub. And she has more than 7 years of experience covering the global energy markets. So we're really looking forward for your presentation. Please take the floor.
Hello everyone, I'm Ahila Karan. I lead the decarbonisation analysis at the Lloyd's Register Maritime Decarbonisation Hub. I'm based in London. And the Maritime Decarbonisation Hub is a little different to the Lloyd's Register group themselves. It's just we are a not-for-profit place providing research on decarbonising the shipping industry for essentially you, the industry. And our mission is essentially to accelerate decarbonisation efforts in the industry, to really drive uptake of zero emissions fuels by 2030. So we're involved in several projects, and among these projects, we are also looking at generating green corridors, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, because we have launched the Silk Alliance this year, focusing on containers. It's very fitting for this conference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our process and what we're looking at with regards to this particular green corridor. But essentially, with this effort, we're trying to look at projects that really catalyse the energy transition. So there are about, I think, 8 green corridors out there. 5 of them have been announced publicly, I think. We're one of them now. And it's all very much at an early stage because this green corridor concept really was born back in November when the Clydeback Declaration was signed, looking at green maritime trade routes between at least 2 ports. So with regards to ours, because there's not really much information out there about the others, I can only divulge in this session about what we're doing right now and our process a little bit for this. So we have created an alliance. It's a multi-stakeholder group. It's not just with ship owners. We're trying to get a cross-industry-wide collaborative effort, which everyone has mentioned several times already. And the aim of this initiative in the first year is to really put together with all the stakeholders across the supply chain a decarbonisation strategy, so a plan. But also drill down into a much shorter term resilient demonstration project with actual tangible actions for each of these stakeholders. We are employing the whole process of system thinking. So we're not just looking at shipping, as I mentioned. We really want to engage the fuel producers as well, the yards, the ports, the cargo owners, everyone along affected by the energy transition, but can't really do it alone, essentially. So we're going through the process. I'm going to just flash up who are the current members. So we've got 5 container owners and operators right now. We have MSC, we have PIL, we have Yangming, Wanhai, we have Express Feeders. Those are our 5. We've also got a shipyard in there. We've got Keppel, we've got the Asian Development Bank, we've got ING. You can see we've got Wärtsilä and Wilhelmsen and Singfar. So we're a mixed bunch. We don't stop there because this is just the first phase. We are looking to engage, and we are currently actively engaging with port authorities, governments. Fuel producers are very important once we've made the selection of what fuel we want to look at. This is specifically for a container ship feeder fleet operating in and around Singapore. It's an intra-Asia container trade that we're looking at. So hopefully we can announce more updates as to who, as and when people join. So we have a process, and this is why we have a process that we have created within the Maritime Decarbonisation Hub that employs this system-wide thinking. So we've had workshops, we are having working groups with the members, we're actively involved, and we're going to run through all of these processes through a workshopping program to come to our decarbonisation strategy for all the members. So ultimately, we're building a common understanding. We're trying to address, it's very difficult when you've got lots of different stakeholders with a variety of challenges. So we all came together, we all looked at what our challenges are, but really we're looking for commonalities in order to address these challenges. So we've kind of identified those opportunities and threats, and now we're really going through that kind of modeling and pre-feasibility stage where we're looking at what is the best energy transition for our kind of alliance, the Silk Alliance as a whole. So we're going through that. That's why it's in a lighter shade of green, because it's ongoing work. And as we go through the process, we'll be doing more of this analysis, giving all the stakeholders in our alliance the right tools, the right knowledge to know which is the best strategy to go for. And at the end, we're hopefully all going to come to a consensus and agree on the best foot forward, and everyone in the value chain can move together simultaneously. So we're sort of de-risking the efforts of just going out there alone and being the only first mover. Ultimately, from this alliance, we're trying to create this long-term strategy, so we're looking out to 2050. But 2050 is very far, so we need milestones in between. So we're looking at also building a short-term action plan for the members as part of this road mapping process. And I think as we move towards COP, we'll hear more about road mapping and green corridors a lot more, because we're hearing a lot more activity around this space. But we really feel that this framework is the guiding principles to help us go through all the checks and balances of how to actually make a decision together, which is a bit of a first for stakeholders, coming from different parts of the industry. Didn't think of this overnight. It wasn't in November we suddenly thought of green corridors. We've been thinking about this for for almost 10 years. It's research-backed, it's evidence-based. We've been publishing for many years now on this. The Lloyd's Register Maritime Decarbonisation Hub was only formalised in 2020, but our research, you can see, goes back much earlier than this. The kind of underlying principles of the Silk Alliance and the process and the first mover framework that we developed, we actually published a study that uses a case study example for containers operating in and around Singapore to Hong Kong, that green corridor route, or a potential green corridor for first mover route there. So we did that study last year, and since then, this is how we've engaged with the industry to show them, look, we have this framework, and they have come to us with interest, and that's how we've created this Silk Alliance this year. I'm going to talk a bit about the first mover framework. I don't want to go into too much detail because I realize I only have 10 minutes. But this was the case study we used at the very beginning of the study. And we found that actually there's a lot of activity within this location. And we were really trying to identify where is a good first mover initiative. And Singapore, it's a big trading hub, we all know. It's a great point to start, because once you've cracked sort of Singapore, you can look at much larger deep sea routes, maybe east-west routes, Transpac routes, other routes coming in through Singapore as well. A bit like Rotterdam, these are big hubs. So it has that scalability factor. But what's really special about feeders and small feeders, the smaller feeders, is that they stay within that region. So you can really forecast your future demand for this fleet with a little more certainty than if you're looking at much longer voyages. So we use this as a really nice kind of first mover ecosystem to plan our fuel demand around. So we've got a stable, impactful fleet. There was about 222 vessels when we were looking through when we did this AIS data search to see what the activity was around that region. So it's got impact. It's relatively stable demand. So it's not just about the fleet side. It's also about the fuel supply side. And this is just a snapshot of the framework for the modeling process. So on the far left side, the light blue is that kind of modeling the fleet analysis and the evolution of the fleet. But as we've seen, we need to look at the fuel supply in conjunction with that fuel demand, right? So we're looking at the evolution of the fleet in context with the fuel supply. So what does the fuel supply have to do to meet the demand for that given fleet? And it creates that certainty. And if you're doing these two things together, you're sort of removing that chicken and egg issue in terms of, will the demand be there? Will the supply be there? You're kind of working in tandem. And that is the process and the underlying thought process for this framework. I'm not going to go into the details. So as I said, we launched earlier this year. This has been 6 months in the making. We've had our first workshops. We were in Singapore. This is from Singapore and Taiwan, where the members are largely based. We had our first workshops. This was the process of getting a common understanding of the problem, finding some opportunities, really getting to know each of the stakeholders, where their strengths lie, where the opportunities lie, who else we need to engage, like how much further this needs to go before we start doing a lot of the modeling process. So these are just images of us in a COVID-friendly workshopping event. So it's very much work in progress. This is, there are lots of statements about fuels being announced. This is for us, it's a case of, as an alliance, we need to come together in terms of what that fuel production pathway will be, because it may not just be one fuel. Also, the complexity around the fuel supply side needs to be considered too. Feedstock availability and production routes, and that's kind of what we're also modeling as part of this process. So the fuel buyers and the fuel sellers can all understand what the dynamics are and what their optionality is. So yes, I welcome any questions about green corridors or any of the initiative we've done here. I'm around all day as well, so if anyone wants to chat more about the energy transition.
Yes, I find a contradiction between these green corridors and the current debate on fuels that you were mentioning at the end, because the debate is very strong. You have the guys that are very much in favor of ammonia, or those that are very much in favor of methanol, or those on hydrogen, or electricity vessels, even the nuclear power. There is a community of guys that think that this is the future for shipping. And sometimes the debate between them is very nasty, even worse than the debate between somebody who is in fossil fuels against the new bunkers. And then this is the situation now. Of course, you have different projects versus prototypes on ammonia, on methanol, on everything of this. And the problem that I see with the green corridors is that you need to solve a little bit the issue of the bunker, because otherwise you bring a mess to the green corridors, where you have many, as you said, you have many stakeholders, and everybody believing that something is, many believing that LNG and dual fuel engines. And this is the unfeasibility that I see with the green corridors, that you have the problems of the bunker, because with the green corridors, you need to decide the infrastructure that you would like. And then this is the complexity.
So,
have any comment?
So yeah, I do actually, because obviously that is an issue and has been the initial issue to get any first mover initiative on board. I understand this whole green corridor concept. I mean, you could call it whatever you want. I mean, this is what it's sort of labeled now in the industry. But the kind of the members were carefully sought out. This isn't just a free-for-all for all container owners to join. It's sort of it's very considered in that all of these stakeholders have a mutual interest to kind of solve a common problem. And this is why we're using this framework, because we totally recognize that there are competing factors and issues around different engine manufacturers perhaps are pushing different solutions, or different supply chain owners having vested interests. But I think in this, from my experience through this process, there is a tide change slightly. I mean, we've heard from IKEA, we've heard from Maersk today as well, like the kind of the cargo owners, the COSEV agreement, there is a huge pressure from the customers to actually find a solution. And we need critical mass. We need an aggregation of demand for fuel in order to drive the production of those fuels. because the demand of one ship owner unless you're a massive liner like Maersk, it's not going to be enough to drive the fuel suppliers, that bunker supply production. So you need to collaborate. And that's kind of how these green corridors are catalysts for these collaboration effects. And also, remember, green corridors are getting a lot of support from governments. Their signatories are signing up to this declaration, and there's a lot of support and backing from like countries to actually get green corridors happening. So there's a public-private, reaction and action happening right now. So I feel like the momentum and tide is shifting, but I do totally agree. This is it was once a very competitive landscape, but I think we're going to have to start looking at competing in other areas now. Yes, so that's kind of my take on how it is.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, maybe also a question from my side, Tahila, on your presentation. So you mentioned the process which you're currently in. How long will this process take? These steps. So, what kind of time frame are you looking at?
Hello. Yeah. You all hear me? So we have a series. Well, we modelled out a series of 6 workshops. So I think, there's no dedicated time because of time constraints. We're all in different parts of the world, but we've had our first. We're going through working groups now. We're going through our second workshops shortly.
Test. It works.
To create the decarbonisation
just
plan and
didn't
the
talk in
modelling
it.
process, we've already kind
work.
of locked that in because we've done the feasibility study on a test case. So in terms of creating that decarbonisation strategy and putting forward all the different modelling options, all the different fuel transition strategies to the members, I don't see as the time-consuming element of this. It's the kind of bringing together all the members to decide and make that decision. So I'm hopeful that it's, as quickly as we do all the, scenario analysis, but, this is, in reality, these are all commercial discussions as well. So, and also, just to be clear, because this is we're not for profit, right? So we don't have a position on this, but the way we see this is that we have to be as vocal as possible about the progress we're making and the approach we're making, and so do all the other green corridors, because we need to work and learn from each other's processes, because it's not clear yet what everyone is currently doing, but I think there's a lot of cross-industry learning that can happen. So, hopefully more updates to come is really what I can say.
Right. Thank you very much for that. Yes, there is a question in the audience.
A question for the Port of Rotterdam. When you see the sustainability reports of maritime companies, Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, Janmin, all the others, they have a very transparent reporting of emissions. You see the 1 and 2 emissions. You don't see the 3 many times because suppliers kind of emissions for the companies. But you have very good detail of the sustainability reports. The best sustainability reports are for the cruise industry, even before the pandemic, because they are one of the few companies in the maritime industry that is B2C, the cruises and the ferries. All the others are B2B. But when you go to the ports, including the Port of Rotterdam, the information is very poor. It's not good. For instance, if you try to understand how much emissions are due to tags, for instance, there is no information. If you want to see to dredgers, for instance, how much of the emission is due to dredgers, you have no information. And I'm saying it's not just the Port of Rotterdam. Most of the ports that I have seen, they have this lack of transparency that is well behind the kind of transparency that you see by the largest container carriers and the cruises. Of course, other sectors in the maritime industry are not as good. For instance, dry bulkers or tankers. This is my question.
I think a great point. I mean, look, I accept the challenge and I underwrite the challenge in that sense as well. So the Port of Rotterdam is, I think I showed one of the slides, we're actively working on becoming a more transparent player within that supply chain as such an important node. Data sharing, we in the Port of Rotterdam and different areas, we have the port base solution, which is a port community system where a lot of information is being shared to optimize your port call. But I agree with you that the emissions around emission, or the information around emissions could be improving a lot more. The emissions portal that I showed as well is one of the solutions we're working on, is an exciting proposal or example of that. I'd very much like to continue that discussion together to see how we can help you, because especially when it comes to the transshipment, and I agree with you, the dredging, etc., the information is being collected through that portal. So we hope to therefore be more transparent and work with the supply chain to really indicate all these supply chain emissions together. So thanks for this challenge. I agree. Let's say it louder for the people in the back.
So a really great challenge here. So we talked a lot about collaboration between stakeholders. I think Ahila just presented an excellent approach on how to do it and how to get there. So maybe Elizabeth, still joining us remotely. What message would you like to convey to the audience on, okay, how do you set up such a collaboration from the shipper sides, and what do you as a shipper actually need from us as maritime players?
That's a good question. First of all, I think it's just about starting collaborating with each other. I don't know if there is a best method on how to do it, or if we even should await a best method on how to collaborate. I believe it is important that there are some basic preconditions in place in order to have a successful collaboration. And the first thing is that you need to share a common goal, and you need to be clear about what you want to achieve. And then that you have the willingness to collaborate. You want to make it work. And then that you also have the ability to see beyond the challenges and not to give up when the complexities kind of heap up, and that you also are persistent in this journey, because it takes a lot of energy and engagement to go into these kind of collaborations, because it's pioneering work, and it's also sometimes collaborating with stakeholders that you're not used to collaborating with. So the climate challenge needs new ways of collaboration. So I think that's important. And then also another thing, because it is such a big challenge, I think it's important to try to slice the elephant into many smaller projects, and maybe not just go all in for a super duper mega complex topic that will be too big to take off. So I think we need this rainbow of different initiatives and the creativity put into these different types of collaborations. And the positive thing is that I really see that the environment is getting there to make this happen. And there are lots of things happening right now.
Yeah, fantastic. So actually letting thousands flowers bloom, and then you get to the end results. Really good.
Yes.
If there are still questions from the audience, please raise your hand, and we'll take that along. And otherwise, I'm also having actually sort of the same question for Maersk, because also you're there from a lot of different perspectives, from a port operator point of view, from also freight forwarder, and from ocean carrier. How do you combine these different roles, and how do you see, okay, where do we invest in as a company, and yeah, how do you get to these collaborations also started with all these different stakeholders which you are also engaged in as a company?
Yeah, I think that as Elizabeth said, it's that's a really good framework, and maybe one of the things to think about is that sometimes you don't know who your stakeholders need to be to collaborate with. On one of my slides, I showed the project looking at using environmental and social descriptors to help investment decisions around renewable energy. And we use that tool actually for capital investment more broadly. And what it helps us do is try and understand local context, and then to talk broadly with communities, stakeholders, regulators, customers that have a really broad base. And I think a really important thing, particularly for a company like us with over 100,000 people. You see our blue ships all around the world. It's about being humble about it as well. When you go, particularly talking, to some stakeholders that maybe you wouldn't normally think about as a big company. I'm going to go and talk to, IKEA or whoever. But if you're talking to local community groups, like go and be humble and really listen. Because actually sometimes you find that there are ideas or opportunities there that might be small, but I think also as with the IKEA presentation, like every step counts or every action counts. And I think there's so much value there that we need to push. So collaborate in those sorts of spaces as well.
Brilliant. Sir.
Just to Maersk, I missed your presentation, but since I see that you are from Maersk, there have been estimations that the cost of decarbonization, when you translate into the cost of transportation of pants or shoes and so on, is going to be very minimum. And the Getting to Zero Coalition has made some of these studies and other institutions. But now, with this the logistic issue that we had, yes, probably the increased price for the final goods is small, but you could see that just this situation created really huge prices for shippers, huge increases. Then when one sees, for the other side, companies like Maersk or the others saying that the cost of decarbonization at the end on the final product is going to be minimal, one has some kind of doubts between these two contradictions, looking at what is happening currently now for shippers.
Yeah, okay. It's quite a tough, complex question, but I think, yeah, I mean, for sure, we see, globally looking at the impacts on supply chains and the effect that's had on supply chains. Currently, these kind of perturbations in the system have really driven up costs. And these are, these short-term kind of, hopefully short-term impacts. But I think the decarbonization element, the strategy around that and this long-term goal that we have to keep sight on, we need everyone to kind of collaborate and play a part in it. And it might be that, yeah, then there is a marginal increase in cost for a piece of, a pair of trainers or a pair of jeans, etc. in the shorter term. But in the longer term, maybe that isn't the case. So, and also the company itself is investing huge capital into those programs as well. So, to be honest, I don't really have a kind of good answer for you on this. But I think it's all about the fact that to drive the change, we are going to have to move early. We're going to have to invest, and I think that then there's lots of players in that field, and we can all collaborate on that journey and keep that long-term goal in sight. And maybe in the future, then everything, it becomes much cheaper as we move into a world where we're using cleaner fuels and we have much more sustainable logistics chains.
Maybe you have room for one final question from the audience? No? Well, then maybe I have just one final question for all four of you. So if you have one key message for the audience to take along from today, what would it be? How are we going to get it started, and how are we going to reach these goals in 2050? If I may begin with you.
You had to start with me, didn't you? I would say perhaps it's not just looking at your own part of that value chain. It's about actually looking much beyond that. And I think this was in Ashley's presentation as well, where you're looking at the fuel that you're using and the grid operators and the kind of how green is the grid electricity supply, and all of those factors come into play, because at some point we're going to be counting our emissions and our footprint, and it's not just our own emissions, it's all the other, it's the scope 3, the wider emissions that are oncoming, and there is a huge regulatory risk. So if we remain this siloed, I feel like we're not prepared for this future regulatory risks around the environment. So it's just looking out and I guess partnering and really understanding, your footprint throughout the value chain better today.
Yeah, I resonate with that completely. I think the Port of Rotterdam never really does any project alone. We always do that with stakeholders. So I think that's something we definitely on the right. Personally, I would just like to say I feel a lot of discussions, especially at a business conference like this, obviously go around risks and price. Personally, I always say, well, what is the risk of doing nothing? I personally think that we've all shown the effects on these slides today, which might in some ways be depressing, but should also be a catalyst for change. So that's something I would like to emphasize. And then, yeah, I guess we can, in that way, can make it happen together. So that would be my message for today.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys have covered it really well. I think keep in mind that if we go back to the kind of planetary boundaries concept, that we have come back from being beyond what is a sustainable place to be in the context of stratospheric ozone. So if we keep that in mind and all this action that's going on, the collaboration, the acceleration, then I think actually the world that we can move into can really be that nice sustainable world, not the depressing world that I introduced my presentation with. So yeah, let's keep the conversations going and work as fast as we can. Don't delay, but then keep checking and making sure that when we look at broader indicators that we're also not affecting things way down in our supply chain. And I think particularly the social element as well, that we have to really, really keep an eye on climate justice or injustice, because it has to be a just transition as well. And I think you mentioned that with job creation, with the blue hydrogen project. So yeah, that's also a hugely important part of this.
And Lisbeth, finally for you.
Yeah, I agree with what you all said here. I think it's super important also to visualize the broader perspective, the value chain perspective, the system perspective, and then try to break that down and become operational, because I think there is this need to move. We need to walk now. And what you said here also, Dawe, with the risk of doing nothing. We need to walk, and then we need to correct as we go, because we cannot stand still.
So fantastic. So thank you very much, all four of our speakers. I think one round of applause is well earned. So thank you, and thank everybody here for attending.